Welcome and thank you for tuning in. You're listening to the Beyond 50 radio program. I'm Daniel Davis. On the program today, we're going to be talking about something that many Americans suffer from and try to find many ways that they can help themselves alleviate the symptoms that they suffer from. On the program today, we're going to be talking with someone who had suffered from an autoimmune disease known as multiple sclerosis. She was able to reverse her own symptoms by following what is known as the Paleo diet principles and functional medicine. Many people try to see if they can alleviate from such things by approach to healing chronic autoimmune conditions by a doctor, researcher, and sufferer of progressive. On the program today, the book is The Wahls Protocol, How I Beat Progressive MS Using Paleo Principles and Functional Medicine. I'd like to welcome to the Beyond 50 radio program today our guest, Dr. Terry Wahls. Terry, how are you doing today?
Fabulous. Thank you for having me.
Your story is quite fascinating. The one thing I wanted to ask first of all, I'm familiar with what multiple sclerosis is, but for the listeners, describe exactly what happens when somebody has this nasty disease, I guess.
Oh, sure. So this is classified as an autoimmune problem. That means we think the immune cells are attacking what should have been healthy cells in our body. So in this case, they're attacking the brain and the spinal cord, and a large part of it is on the, the wiring between those cells and the insulation on that wiring called the myelin. As that is damaged, people can have symptoms either affecting their senses, such as vision or balance or pain, or they can have symptoms affecting their motor strength, so coordination, balance, difficulties walking, or problems with their hands. The symptoms, by definition, you have at least 2 episodes of problems separated by time and space. So you have to have 2 episodes of these funny neurological symptoms. Usually there is lesions found in the spinal cord or brain, and there's abnormal spinal fluid. And at present, conventional physicians would treat this by giving the individuals drugs to suppress the immune cells and symptoms.
Now, what's fascinating about your story is that you're a clinical professor of medicine at the University of Iowa. You're also a staff physician at the Iowa City Veterans Affairs Hospital, where you teach medical students and residential physicians, and you work with patients in traumatic brain injury. But yet you yourself were confined to a tilt-recline wheelchair for 4 years, but because of following what is known as the Wahls Protocol, you're now bicycling 5 miles to work each day? Is that something that typically happens when somebody has something like this autoimmune disorder?
Certainly not. Early on with MS, it has a relapsing, remitting course. So you get symptoms, and then things improve, then you get more symptoms. But the vast majority of folks will, with enough time, convert to the progressive phase where there's no more improvements. So the last time I had any hint of improvement was 2001. By 2003, my physicians had told me I was in the progressive phase of my illness. And at that point, there'd be no more spontaneous improvements. Functions once lost would be gone forever. And so that's when I tried the chemotherapy that they recommended. I got the tilt-recline wheelchair, and then I tried that new biologic drug, Dietary, but continued to slowly and continually decline. And I had completely accepted that there would be no reversal, no return of functions. And at the summer of 2007, I thought it likely I would eventually become bedridden by my illness, quite possibly demented. At that point, I was so weak I couldn't sit up in a regular chair anymore. I had to be in a recliner or in bed. And I could walk very short distances using 2 walking sticks. I had severe fatigue. I was exhausted by 10 in the morning and was beginning to have problems with brain fog.
Now, what's fascinating is that, as a researcher, you discovered that when you did research in animal models of disease, which is described as being somewhere around 20 to 30 years ahead of clinical practice, that you were kind of finding ways to I guess, avoid becoming bedridden. So you began to study in PubMed.gov, to search, articles on the latest multiple sclerosis research. And, you were somebody who was really adamant about what can I do rather than following the traditional way that this is treated to sound like alleviate, maybe slow things down that sound inevitable, but you were actually looking for ways to turn things around.
Well, actually, I hadn't thought I could turn things around. I was just trying to slow down the loss and keep being able to walk the very small amount of walking that I was doing. And so I was reading about mouse models of MS, mouse models of Parkinson's disease, Alzheimer's, Huntington's disease, and began implementing some of those concepts with various vitamins and supplements. And it became apparent that I was slowing my decline, and if I missed my vitamins and supplements, I was even more exhausted and had more difficulty getting up out of bed. And that gave me a lot of encouragement that, okay, maybe I can't reverse my disease, but certainly my vitamins and supplements are giving my brain some help.
Mm-hmm. Now, what's fascinating about this is that you had discovered what is known as functional medicine. Describe what that exactly means for our listeners.
So, functional medicine is a support medical education system for physicians and other healthcare professionals. We're trying to use the latest science to take care of complicated chronic health problems, and we're addressing dietary and lifestyle factors that contribute to disease. And I think we're doing a much more effective job at getting at the root cause of why we develop these chronic health problems, why autoimmunity occurs, why high blood pressure, diabetes occurs, and what are the factors that affect how our gut works, how our brain works, our mitochondria, our hormonal balance, and what are the things that we can do, aside from just relying on drugs, to correct those imbalances.
Mm-hmm. I find it fascinating. On the program, we like to talk about natural ways of exploring healing and reversing symptoms. And one of the things that I found interesting is there seems to be a reasonably consistent observation about digestion and autoimmune disorders. What are your thoughts on something like that?
Well, if we look at our immune cells are to protect us from potential threats. Mm-hmm. And every day we have to eat all of our food, and it comes through us, and that's a huge source of nourishment and potential threat. So our body has 80% of our immune cells lining our gut, where they have to figure out molecule by molecule as these food particles enter our bloodstream, and are they okay? Is it food or is it a threatening organism? And if we are exposing our gut to molecules that our immune cells see as threats, that markedly drives up the inflammation and begins the first step of many, many disease states.
Mm-hmm. Now, talk about, for instance, when it comes to these autoimmune diseases, have you seen, as you go back to the history, because you seem to have done extensive research on this, when there was a spike or a beginning to rise where it just seemed abnormal for humans to be having these kinds of things occur?
Sure. So, before 1700, the main cause of death was infection and trauma. And there was a very high infant mortality. So if you made it into adulthood, you had a very good chance of making it into your 70s and 80s.
And this was back before 1700?
Yes.
I find that fascinating that you say that, because they're saying, when you look back, we kind of assume that maybe you would live to be about 30, maybe 40 at best, but you're saying before 1700, if you made it past childhood or at least infancy, you had a good chance of living to be 70 and 80 years old, which is what they assume today is a better lifespan than then, but it sounds like it was good even then.
It's absolutely true.
Wow.
What we don't realize is the main cause of death was infection.
Wow.
So there's about a 50% mortality before the age of 15 because of infection and trauma.
Mm-hmm.
So everybody was trim, fit. In the 1700s is when we first began to have sugar and white flour for the masses. Breastfeeding declined because women began to enter the workforce. And that's when we see obesity, diabetes, and heart disease begin to emerge. Autoimmunity is described for the first time in the 1800s. It's still very, very rare. And then as our sugar consumption, and at that time we ate about 5 pounds of sugar. By 2000,
now 5 pounds of sugar in relation
per year.
Per year, okay.
Per year, thank you. So in 2000 we're eating 300 pounds of sugar
My
per
goodness.
year. And so there's been a steady increase in the rates of high blood pressure, obesity, diabetes, and autoimmunity. With World War II, the sugar, right after that, sugar intake markedly spiked, and at that same time there was a marked increase in the rates of autoimmunity. Some conditions 5 to 10 times as much as there had been in 1950. And certainly our food has radically changed, a lot more sugar, 150 pounds a year, a lot more white flour, 130 pounds a year. We changed our fats from butter and saturated animal fats to trans fats and many more vegetable oils, which had been previously considered toxic byproducts that had to be discarded. And then we've added an immense number of food-like chemicals as flavor enhancers to stimulate consumption of foods, increase corporate profits, make these foods hyper-palatable. We've had a big change in our food supply, and in that same time period, there's been a dramatic uptick in all sorts of chronic diseases, including autoimmune problems.
It's such a fascinating thing to hear this, because consistently it seems, as I've spoken with doctors, medical professionals, even just regular people who actually began to take responsibility for their health, food seems to be that consistent thing that when they changed that, went to what seemed to be a more natural way, the way that we used to eat before production and manufacturing, that a lot of these things become reversed, and here it's so available right at our fingertips.
It is completely available. Most of us choose what we eat every day, and so we have the possibility to change our diets. But I also have a great deal of empathy in that our diet has been so manipulated by the processed food industry that has created these food products that are so addicting. It can be very, very challenging to adopt and then sustain these new dietary habits.
Now, what's fascinating is that you also incorporated what is known as the Paleo diet. Describe exactly what that is.
Well, the traditional Paleo diet, there would be thousands of different types, because it would have been the foods that locale and clan of people were eating before the dawn of agriculture. And so the foodstuffs would be very different in the Arctic than they would be in the Amazonian rainforest or in the Great Desert of Australia. But every society has learned how to maximize the vitamin mineral content and calories with the foods that were available. Those of us who are in modern times are trying to use foods that would be available that are not stressing sugar, flours, grains, dairy, legumes. Instead, we focus on meat, fish, vegetables, a small amount of berries. In my program, I did, because I also have empathy for people who are choosing a vegetarian life for spiritual and religious reasons, to create a protocol that they could use to improve the health of their diet and reduce the risk of autoimmunity as well for them.
Now, as I was reading through your book, you actually, I guess this is for lack of a better way to put this, kind of create the argument about the vegetarian diet, because we hear so much how you need to move away from eating meats and animal nutrition, proteins, and move more toward a vegetarian diet because it's really healthier for you. Now, back in the 1980s, my first wife, her brother and sister, or should I say sister and brother-in-law, they were vegetarians, so from time to time I'd get shanghaied into going to those kinds of restaurants with them. And I got to a point where I could go into the place and realize right away, okay, we're in a vegetarian restaurant. Okay, that's fine. I don't mind. But what I found fascinating about a fair amount of the people that came into these restaurants that were proclaimed vegetarians is they were pale. They tend to have those dark bags under their eyes, and I'm thinking, they don't look very healthy, so what's going on here?
So for people who are vegetarian, they're eating a lot more grain, a lot of legumes, and if they have the genetics that put them at risk for having a abnormal immune response to the proteins in the grain and in legumes, it will rev up the inflammation. They may have difficulty absorbing their minerals, so they're going to be at greater risk for anemia, a greater risk for autoimmunity. If they are not taking care to make sure they're getting B12, because you can't get enough B12 from plant sources, then they're going to develop a neurodegenerative process impairing their balance and eventually their thinking ability and judgments. It is possible to be a vegetarian and maintain excellent health, but you have to be very careful about how you do that. And I was a vegetarian 20 years. I did not pay adequate attention to being sure that I had a complete protein. I wasn't taking B12. And so I probably did create protein deficiencies, B12 deficiencies, mineral deficiencies for myself. And I think that was part of why I became so ill. In my book, I tell folks, if they're vegetarian and they have great health, no mental health problems, and ideal body weight, then they likely have figured out a plan that works for them. I encourage them to be mindful of their protein and particularly their B12. If they have any health issues, then I encourage them to be open to the possibility that their interpretation of the vegetarian diet may be contributing to their poor health. And then I give them some directions on how to evaluate their diet and improve the quality of it.
I know when I had a guest on the program, she actually wrote a book on the paleo diet, and I said, when you take a look at how we started as humans and you see the writing on the wall, specifically caves, you notice there's a lot of celebration in the hunt. Yeah. But as she was describing is that, yes, we did eat meat, but we also celebrated and we didn't eat a lot. It generally was a pound a week or something like that. I don't remember what it was. But the other thing, too, is we were also on the move a lot. Yeah. And when you take a look at what you're describing, that by, just before the 1800s that we started increasing our intake of processed sugar, for instance, that, by the mid to late 1900s, we found ourselves sitting around because of the modern conveniences of technology, not being as active anymore. You can begin to see, just by reason, why these things began to occur and increase. And then today, when you take a look at, for instance, the epidemics of cancer, you're looking at multiple sclerosis and these other autoimmune disorders and diseases, is that now we've got this way that we've created what I call a fashion fad industry out of these things. Let's go out and let's fight and, have this war on cancer. And all these millions of dollars are being raised, but yet they're not further along in their research than they were 50, 60, 80 years ago. And you kind of scratch your head and say, if these people are raising all this money for all this research, where does the money go and how come we're not further along? And yet the answer seems to be right here in our lap, right in our front yard, and we want to look past that to a horizon that seems to elusively continue to get further and further away.
You know, I talk about this a lot, that we focus on disease in the research and how research is funded on particular diseases. Imagine if we had taken all of that money and studied what is it that creates health and taught people more explicitly how to create optimal health in their cells, which then would lead to healthier organs and healthier bodies. I think the medical paradigm is entirely is unfortunately focused on disease when we should be focused on creating health. That it's that how our DNA talks to the lifetime of diet choices, physical activity level, toxin exposures, social networks, family connections, stress levels, prior infection history, the health of the bacteria living in my bowels. It's that interaction that creates either the disease state I'm in or the health state. And by teaching my patients and the people who read my books how to create that healthier and healthier environment for their DNA, they often find themselves getting younger and younger, healthier and more vital, the need for medication steadily declining, and they are often able to reverse and roll back chronic disease after chronic disease.
Mm-hmm. Now, it's funny because I remember back in the early part of the 1990s, it seemed to be that every time you turned on the television or the radio or even looked through a magazine, there was always a new diet book out there telling us how we were supposed to eat, what the best way to go was. One of the biggest confusing factors that seemed to flip-flop more than sandals was that of fat. And I love how you really talk about fat facts in your book. Some of the conversions I actually made some years ago, for instance, I replaced dairy with things like almond and coconut milk, which actually, to me, was much better anyway, because I began to feel when I was drinking milk, not that I was drinking it regularly, but from time to time, but all of a sudden I started having these regular stomach aches, and I would drink milk to actually alleviate. That's what was beginning to happen, and I went to see what was known as a body talk specialist, somebody who kind of tunes into your body to let you know what the body's talking about. What I was astounded about, she says, you know, your body is telling me that you're really having a problem with dairy, mainly milk. Now, I still like my cheeses from time to time, you know, my cream sauces from time to time. But I said, you know, that's interesting because for the longest time, I actually had pretty much eliminated milk out of my diet, and then all of a sudden I brought it back in again, mostly vitamin D, whole milk, not the 2% watered down stuff, because my parents used to live across the street from a dairy, so I got used to what that was like. But anyway, when I did that, the pain just pretty much almost went away overnight. And I thought, wow, okay. And since then, I just haven't went back to it. And then I began to replace it with coconut milk and coconut oil. But let's talk about the fat facts, because I think that's one of those things when you look at programs today like The Biggest Loser and all these weight loss solutions, fat seems to be this biggest thing they focus on, and it seems to be one of the most confusing things for people to understand.
Mm-hmm. Well, every cell that you and I have is wrapped in fat, as a fat wrapper to keep the liquid material of the cell inside the cell. And our brain is about 60 to 70% fat. So we absolutely need fat to have a healthy cell membrane and a healthy brain. When we go on, and after World War II, we demonized cholesterol because we thought it was by lowering the egg and butter content during World War II. That was why people had much less heart disease. Because
of more egg and butter in their diet.
Well, during World War II, they had very much less egg and butter.
Oh, I see.
And so they said, oh, that's probably why there was fewer heart attacks. But what they forgot to also notice was there is very much less sugar and white flour. And people had a patriotic duty to grow vegetables in their garden. In fact, 80% of the vegetables consumed during World War II were from people's own gardens. And, of course, it was before chemical fertilizer, so that was all organic food. So the quality of the diets actually went up considerably. But we demonized fat, and when we demonized fat, we lowered the fat intake, asked people to have more unsaturated vegetable oils, which was completely a new food, and took butter, eggs, bacon out of people's diets. The rate of obesity and diabetes markedly surged. And we discovered that the scientific link between cholesterol and heart disease was not very good, as we thought. And we thought maybe it'd be better if we used the good cholesterol HDL levels. And that was somewhat better correlated. Still not the best. Now, then we went after low density cholesterol. Maybe that was a big link. And that correlates somewhat better still. Now scientists are thinking that maybe it's the very low density, tightly dense particles of cholesterol that are the problem. There's another group of scientists who've recognized that it's when the cholesterol molecule gets damaged by infection or sugar or free radicals, toxins, that makes the cholesterol molecule very tiny and very sticky for making these clogged arteries. So the damage appears to be less the cholesterol than whether the cholesterol molecule's been damaged, particularly by a trans fat molecule, by sugar, by bacterial particles, heavy lead, mercury, arsenic. We need fat. We need fat to make cell membranes. We need it to make our brain. We need it to make hormones. And many more scientists are moving away from saying fat's the problem. We're moving much more to saying sugar, free radicals, and heavy metal poisoning is a far bigger driver.
Mm-hmm. Well, I know one of the culprits, too, some time ago as I was interviewing a guest on the program, I was asking, why is there such an increase in diabetes to the point that it's perhaps 1 in 3 people that may take on at least type 2 diabetes? And this was almost 10 years ago. And she had pointed out, well, there's been a tremendous increase in, for instance, fructose corn syrup and corn syrup into the diet. And so, you slowly start looking into those kind of things and the documentaries and the information that's available out there. One of the largest grown plants that we have in America, if not the single largest, is corn. And there are mountains of this stuff, and they have to figure out, well, what do we do with all this corn? So why not develop it into a chemistry protocol and develop something like corn sugar and cornstarch? And I'm thinking, wow, is that really that simple? Is that what the answer is?
Well, it's a big part of it. If I want to create metabolic syndrome, prediabetes and diabetes in an animal model, I feed them a lot of fructose, which is, of course, the main ingredient to the high fructose corn syrup. And fructose is the main ingredient in many of these sugar replacements like coconut sugar, agave syrup. So people have to, I encourage everyone to try to avoid fructose and liquid calories of any type. I'd much rather people get rid of their sweet flavorings because they'll create some trouble for their brain and for their body.
Mm-hmm. Because what I found astounding about that is just a couple of days ago I was at a store, and you're beginning to see there's the regular section in produce, and then there's the organic section in produce, okay? And then around the shelves in this area here you're starting to see sprout up things such as aloe vera juice, aloe vera water, coconut milk, coconut water, coconut juice, almond milk, and it goes on and on and on. But what astounded me is they also are now starting to create these chia drinks. Okay, so now you get your chia seeds in these juice-style drinks.
Yeah.
And another one was the acai berry or acai berry. I usually say either or because people, okay, that's what you mean. So I picked up this juice that has, it says acai juice. I'll just call it that. I go, okay, there you go. There's something that's supposed to be good for you, this awesome berry from the Amazon jungle. Turned around, looked at the ingredients, and wouldn't you know, the fourth ingredient happened to be corn syrup.
We have to keep reading the labels. I think that is so important.
You know, so here they're touting these things to be great for you, but the corn syrup is in there.
You know, and that's because we're biologically wired to like sweet things. They become addictive, and they can create that overconsumption. So there's a big incentive for companies to add those sugar in those food additives to make the food hyper-palatable and drive overconsumption.
Mm-hmm. Now, why are we biologically wired towards sweet things? Why does nature design us that way?
Well, so 2 million years ago, that's when our species, our family, the Homo family, started out in equatorial Africa. 500,000 years ago, Homo sapiens were around. At that point, if something was sweet, it was a berry. And berries have a lot of very helpful antioxidant compounds that are great for us and great for the microbiome, the bacteria living in us. What nature didn't anticipate was that we would, over the next 500,000 years, figure out how to extract this sugar from our natural food. So instead of having access to berries intermittently during the summer, and that's the only time you had access to those sugars, now we have access to this sugar without fiber, and so it now can account for 40% of our calories. We're not biologically ready for that. If you look at our the animal models and human models of addiction studies, when we do PET scans of the brain to see what parts of the brain lights up when you take a drug of abuse, or you take sugar or high fructose corn syrup, what is apparent is the similar parts of the brain light up. Our dopamine areas, producing areas, are stimulated, which creates a lot of pleasure and attention. And because a big jump in blood sugar, as driven by sugar, and it appears to also be driven by high fructose corn syrup, also drives that dopamine, also drives the same pathways that we have for addiction. So we find these foods comforting, we find them addicting. Most people will go through some level of withdrawal if we abruptly stop those foods. If you have a mouse or a rat study and you give them the choice of sugar, nicotine, alcohol, or narcotic, they will choose the sugar.
Mm-hmm. And it's really fascinating, too, to realize that, that we need to have that, but there's a specific reason why. And certainly we didn't have processed sugar 2 million years ago.
You could get honey occasionally. Mm-hmm. It was a very not easy to get. There's a high price. So honey would have been a very ceremonial use type of food.
Now, one of the things that I really was interested in for you to talk about here in the book is that you talk about, for instance, how a lot of times in the vegetarian diet they'll try to bring their protein in through legumes, beans, things like that. And you talked about the importance of, if you're going to have that a lot of times it's best to soak them overnight to create what's known as sprouting. Tell us why that's important.
So the grains and legumes will have phytates and lectins in them. The phytates lock down the minerals so they can't be absorbed. That's as a protection against animals like you and me that would be eating their seed. And when the grain or legume is soaked in water, after about 6 hours, an enzyme called phytase is generated, which cuts the phytate away from the minerals, and now these minerals are much more readily absorbed. It also changes the lectins and makes the lectins less irritating to our immune cells. And there's increasing recognition that certainly when we first began consuming grains and legumes, we were in fact soaking them and making them soft and using them in that fashion as opposed to the dry, hard fashion that we have now. So by soaking at least 6 hours, preferably 24, you're making the grain or legume much more easily digested. The minerals are more readily absorbed. You're decreasing cooking time. And in addition, you're increasing some of the vitamin contents because as the seeds go through the germination process, they begin making enzymes and vitamins that were not present in the dry seed.
Mm-hmm. Now, what's fascinating for our listeners to know about the Wahls protocol is this, and it made so much sense as I was reading this. Now, as I was mentioning earlier in the program, back in the 1990s, all the confusion about all the diet fads that were available out there, and it created such, I guess, aggravation for me, I thought, I'm going to go and find this out for myself. I'm really tired of hearing, vitamin E is good for you. Well, now it's not so good for you. Fats are good. Well, now it's not so good. There's good cholesterol. There's bad cholesterol. It was like they were taking the whistle in Pavlov's experiment, and every time they blew it, just taking that dog and turning it any direction they could find so people would latch on to it. And what I love about what you had wrote about in here is as I began to go to the library and explore basically a list of books that had to do with diet, and allow the ones that jumped out at me that seemed to resonate and make the most sense. One of them was an interesting book on diet and nutrition, a holistic approach, and it was a 400-page book, and he was really breaking things down and giving you histories and so forth. And what really stood out for me was something that I think gets overlooked when it comes to the diet is regions. There were certain regions and why people ate certain things. And, for instance, I know that on your website you actually talk about how in Africa that Africans tended to eat insects and amphibians and lizards and then a lot of plants. Native Americans, it was fish and meats and a lot of plants. But what you talk about in your book and in relation to what I'm describing here is that rather than a lot of what seems to be that good thing, that you have a lot of balance and many good things, and it brings together a nice collaboration that is well in balance, hence a true balanced diet. Describe that for our listeners, if you could.
Well, I want people to realize that there are many humans have always managed, with given enough time, traditionally learned how to maximize their nutrition for their locality, using foods that be available. We think that most societies had about 200 different plant and animal species that they would consume over that year. When we analyze these diets, they're radically different, and yet they all have 2 to 10 times the recommended daily allowance for our vitamins and minerals and essential fats, and are far more nutrition than the standard American diet. So it makes me humble to say that, there are many ways to organize your diet for maximal health, but the principles are always going to be the same. You want the most vitamins, minerals, antioxidants, a correct balance of essential fats that you can get per calorie from food that's fresh, in season, locally available. Now, most people, we've lost our connection with our ancestors to know how to do that. So we need some guidance. I created a plan based on my reading on what basic science says my brain cells and my mitochondria need. And then I looked at what foods could I get here in the Midwest of the United States. And then I had a big list of foods that I should be eating. Then as I began to teach this to other people, I had to organize it in a way that makes a easily teachable, understandable message. And that's how I came up with the greens, the sulfur-rich, the color, high-quality proteins, preferably meat, fish, and some nuts and seeds. And then as people progress, I talk about things like organ meats, fermented foods, why you want to sprout your nuts and seeds. and why you might want to think about a ketogenic diet depending on your particular health issues.
Mm-hmm.
But I stress you have to adapt this to your region, your locale, and your culture, but you still want to get these kinds of food groups in, because that is how I can have the greatest confidence that you're feeding your brain and your mitochondria the nutrition that they require.
Mm-hmm. Now, in your research, have you found a connection also? And certainly take this if you would like to, but I've been curious because of personal experience with this. We seem to be seeing an increase, especially in our children, of autism and the autistic spectrum. What do you think that's all about? Because I've approached this from certain doctors, and they're pretty much saying a lot of what you're saying. A lot of it starts in the diet. If you notice, in one specific case, I talked with a doctor who has more than 30 years of experience with this, and he says true autism begins at birth. And he says, the designation of true autism is your child has never really shown affection, never smiles, and just some of those things there. But that most of what we're seeing is the children were normal, and then by about the age of 5 to 7 years old, you see it's like a light switch just gets turned off.
Something happened, yep.
And people are scratching their heads, and you're seeing this, before it seemed so rare, and then, of course, many people remember the movie Rain Man, but after that time, it seemed like the numbers increased, and now it's something like 1 in 65.
1 in 65.
That's alarming.
If it's a boy child, about 1 in 30.
Mm-hmm.
If you're in New Jersey, it's 1 in 43.
Mm-hmm.
When I went to medical school, it's about 1 in 10,000. I'm sort of an old geezer. I'm 59, so that was back in the early 80s. It's pretty clear that there's been some major changes in our environment, and there's probably multiple factors that all contribute to genetic vulnerability. And depending on how many genes you have that put you at risk, if you have many genes, it takes a smaller dose of the wrong environment. If you have just a few troublesome genes, then it takes a much larger dose. Mm-hmm. Things that certainly look very troublesome, exposures to heavy metals, lead, mercury, arsenic, and with all of the coal-fired plants going on in China, that's increasing the rain of the heavy metals in western U.S. and across the Pacific, contaminating our food. And if you have difficulty processing these compounds, they're going to accumulate in your body. Because of all the sugar, we're creating a dysbiosis, growing the wrong bacteria in our bowels, increasing the risk for food sensitivity problems. Glyphosate. There's some very interesting correlation studies that glyphosate, the herbicide Roundup, used on corn and soybeans. And so if you're having conventional food, you're exposed to glyphosate. Now, glyphosate is also put on wheat prior to harvest. And so now we have a lot of glyphosate in wheat. That glyphosate appears to be strongly correlated with as we dramatically increased our use of glyphosate on those 3 crops I've mentioned, the autism rates markedly increased. Then there, of course, has been a huge debate, what's the role of vaccinations? And there was a concern, there's been concern that is the burden of the frequent vaccinations, maybe not so much the active part of the vaccine, but the adjuvant that is added to create a more vigorous immune response is a small toxin in a very small dose. But now that we're taking so many of these vaccines at the same time and in short order, some scientists are beginning to question what is the safety of those adjuvants. Another question that is being raised, and we don't have the answer to this one, is that's the hygiene hypothesis. And that observation is that for most of our species timeline, we were all getting these infections, these viruses, these bacteria as young kids. Of course, some of these kids will die. But perhaps we need to get those infections as infants and very young children to properly mature our immune cells so as we become adults, they can fight infections and not attack self. Mm-hmm. And there's increasing enthusiasm for this hygiene hypothesis that we need these bacteria, we need these viruses, and the use of the vaccines and the antibiotics has shifted which bacteria and viruses live in our guts, on our skin, and that shift is creating big health problems. Mm-hmm. So, these are very complicated questions. I certainly don't have the answer. I feel confident in saying the environment is absolutely a big part of the problem. And what I have found, we've had tremendous success with many individuals having a wide variety of neurological and mental health problems, including autism, mm-hmm. who've used our concepts and have had seen the youngsters wake up and begin to reemerge with much greater mental health and much greater effectiveness again. And we see our adults, come back from their PTSD, their traumatic brain injury, their severe psychiatric problems as they adopt the protocol.
I know what's fascinating, too, for our listeners out there, Terry, is this. Or do you prefer Dr. Wahls?
Dr. Terry is fine.
Okay, Dr. Terry then. Yeah. Dr. T, yeah. That's what we'll call you. It's really fascinating to realize the tremendous resilience the human body has. It's a miracle, isn't it?
Well, you and I, we're alive because of this, what I call self-correcting chemistry. We have to have a very specific range of sodium, potassium, magnesium, calcium in the levels in the cell and a different level outside of the cell. And if that range gets too high or too low, we die. Mm. So for most of us, if we can stop poisoning ourselves with these toxic compounds and now flood them with the best possible nutrition that you and your family can afford, that self-correcting chemistry will begin to repair you molecule by molecule. Mm-hmm. And that's why, time and time again, people come back in looking younger and younger, healthier and healthier. I laugh. There's two trajectories I see. The women are coming in, they are beaming and telling me, Doc, I'm so happy the weight is falling off without being hungry, and this is the best I've felt in years. So they're very excited about this new body image. But I see lots and lots of men. The guys are coming back in, they're losing weight too, but they're beaming because, Doc, my love life, I've gotten my love life back. And so they're very excited about performance issues. Mm-hmm. But both sets of people, they keep looking younger and younger, healthier and more vital. We're often able to reduce medication and eliminate medication after medication mm-hmm. as they sustain these new dietary and lifestyle patterns.
One thing I would also like to touch on is we're just about to the end of our time here is the gut-brain connection. And I know that you talk about fermented foods in your book, and it's really fascinating to read this because this is, to me, something that's kind of emerging more often now than before, the thought of probiotics. It's funny, as an adult, I hadn't heard about really probiotics or anything like that until my wife and I got together about 11 years ago. And she takes probiotics, daily, usually 1 or 2 capsules, or there's a particular juice that has what they call this friendly bacteria. Mm-hmm. Now, describe for our listeners what that is and sources and why that's important, because you're hearing a lot more about the gut-brain connection. Again, as I alluded to earlier in the program, digestion and what you take in is the first source you should look at for why you feel and are the way you are?
This is a very exciting area of research. You and I have about 10 trillion body cells. We have 100 trillion bacteria, yeast, single-cell parasites living in our bowels, in our mouth, and on our skin. And we now realize that we also have 1,000 trillion viruses as well on our skin and our bacteria. And how these bacteria and viruses interact, digest our food, digest each other's stuff, creates a lot of biologically active compounds that get into our bloodstream and either help us conduct the biology of life in a good, healthy, robust way, or conducts the biology of life in an inflamed, diseased, sickly, very disease-prone way. We realize now if we have a lot of white sugar and white flour, high fructose corn syrup in our diet, we have a different mix of bacteria with different biologic activity that creates cravings for sugar and sweet things and alters our behaviors, increasing problems with mental illness and increasing the risk of autoimmunity, cancers, obesity. There may be a time, and there's a lot of money being put into this, looking at how could we use this information to create probiotic capsules to replace the prescription drugs. I have a much more simple look at this. Why not teach people how to eat the ancient foods that fed our old friends? And so that's why I stress, 9 cups of vegetables, plenty of fiber, so you're pooping 2 to 3 times a day, but not in your pants. If you're doing that, you probably need a little less fiber. And fermented foods, because we have, at least for 10,000 years, and there are studies that suggest for 100,000 years, we've been consuming fermented foods. And those fermented foods are probably a very big part of populating our gut with those bacteria that help us conduct the biology of life more correctly.
Mm-hmm. Now, what specifically are fermented foods?
You might think of something like sauerkraut, kimchi. So these are foods that are cultured with lactobacillus. You need to have organic foods and a starter and some salt. And you can put them in a fermentation crock for a week or so. Then I pack them up in the fridge, and they'll keep for many, many months. They're easy. It's a fun family project. And actually my family has really come to enjoy fermented cabbage, kimchi. Everybody likes kimchi a great deal. Kombucha is very fun to brew and make. Beet kvass. I make fermented chia seed pudding. You can make fermented non-dairy type yogurts as well. Mm-hmm. It's a fun and it's an easy way when you're getting too many vegetables. Like, oh my God, I can't get them all eaten. I just put them into a ferment, and then we'll have them for months.
Mm-hmm. Now, I know a lot of people listening here would think, geez, you're talking about a lot of cups of fruits, you're talking about a few cups of vegetables. I don't know if I can eat all this daily like you're suggesting, but, one of the greatest inventions that man has ever made was the Vitamix.
Yes. Well,
and I do the smoothie thing, and I'll tell you, you can get what she's recommending in ways that you couldn't imagine, and it feels pretty darn good.
And the other thing, the reason people can't imagine 6 to 9 cups of vegetables is I'm not giving up my 6 to 10 servings of bread.
Oh.
And so if I'm not going to give up all my bread and grain, I couldn't possibly eat all those vegetables. Mm-hmm. But if we dump the grain and the white potatoes, and I eat sufficient protein, and then lots of vegetables, you'll be okay, because you'll be hungry enough. But if you're thinking, I'm not going to give up my cereal, toast, bread, pasta, then you won't be eating those vegetables, and your health will not improve.
I remember being at a seafood restaurant one time, and the table next to us, there was a girl, I think she was in her late teens. She ordered a nice big bowl of clam chowder and bread and described to the server, this is how I eat my clam chowder with my bread. the sourdough bread. I thought, well, it's only a matter of time.
Yeah.
Fascinating stuff. I love this for the listeners out there. The book is The Wahls Protocol. Our guest, Dr. Terry Wahls. Your website, people can find out more about this. I know it's quite extensive on the information that you provide there as well.
So that's Terry, Terry, Wahls, WAHLS.com. I have many people asking if they can be my patient. I tell them that I don't have a private practice, but we do have support programs that are available on the shop page if people are wanting to have even more information than what we have in the book.
And I know that we'll be spinning this interview out onto YouTube, so many more people will be exposed to what is known as the Wahls Protocol. And one final thing, go nuts. Tell us a little bit about that. Well,
nuts are a terrific source of vitamin E. And vitamin E helps protect our essential omega-3 and omega-6 fats.
Excuse me, for instance, better than fish, do you think?
No.
No? Okay.
But I would have them with the fish.
Okay.
Because you get omega-3, omega-6 fats in your bloodstream.
So a macadamia halibut would be a really good combination, in other words.
Actually, it would be.
Okay.
Because the omega-3 fats will protect those omega, need protection by the vitamin E. So you don't want to be vitamin E deficient. And your best source is going to be like avocados, sunflower seeds, sunflower butter, almond seeds, some fresh walnuts. So I do encourage nuts. I think they're a little bit better for you if you'll take the time to sprout them. And I love to have lots of avocados.
And sprouting meaning you take the raw nuts that you buy and you actually soak them in water overnight?
Yeah.
Okay.
And then rinse them off. And you could put a handful in your morning smoothie. That's really great. You could also put them back in a dehydrator to dry them out and make them crunchy again. And that works very well, too.
Well, very good. Your website one more time?
Terry, Terry, Wahls, WAHLS.com.
Dr. Terry Wahls, I want to thank you for joining us on the program today to take the mystery, out of the diet and also to create, the connection of how we can reverse a lot of these nasty things that are out there and helping people to get off the medications which seem to increase as they take medication. Sometimes using those can be a good thing, but I think we're over-medicating ourselves sometimes when the best medicine is actually the food in our own garden.
Absolutely.
Thank you for being on the program today.
Thank you so much.
We want to thank you, the listeners out there. Again, you can find out more by visiting the website that we were talking about earlier, which is terrywahls.com. I'm Daniel Davis. Thank you for tuning in. This is the Beyond 50 radio program, and remember, live your day past halfway.